Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA, a national network of educators dedicated to making human rights education a central focus of preschool through higher education in the United States. I'm your host, Bill Fernekes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA. This podcast aims to raise the level of awareness about human rights education and help listeners engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a central focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education. Today's program is our second conversation with Nancy Flowers, one of the world's leading experts and practitioners in human rights education. Nancy serves as a member of the HRE USA Advisory Board and continues to publish about HRE in professional journals and books. She also is the inspiration behind the Flowers Fund, created by HRE USA to support innovation and mentorship in human rights education in the U.S. The fund provides grants to individuals and organizations on an annual basis through a competitive review process. Well, Nancy, it's great to have you back again after our first segment, which was very interesting. Now we're going to go to part two, and I'd like to begin by asking you about your advocacy for women's rights and how you segued or integrated that in your overall conception of human rights education.
Well, there are several stories connected with that, and they start with a person rather famous in the field of human rights education, Shulamit Koenig. I got in touch with her because when I want to go back and just say that when we began, we were sending letters with stamps. There was no internet. I remember that it was a great technological leap forward when we figured out that we could do conference telephone calls. It was like, oh, we could all be in the same room, so that you couldn't Google human rights education and look for people doing it. But somehow I got connected to Shula, who had an organization called the People's Decade for Human Rights Education. But her interest was international. She really wasn't. She was an Israeli living in New York, but her focus was international. So she wasn't much, and she was not fond of Amnesty International. She felt that we focused entirely too much on abuses and not on the positive as human rights as a way of life. A great argument that went on between us for about 30 years. But so Shula and I we were in touch a lot, and she was, I have to say, while I'm speaking of her, she really was the advocate that pushed the hardest at the UN to get the UN Decade for Human Rights Education. Right. The UN Human Rights Conference on Human Rights, which was in 1995, was a landmark in many ways, and Shula got it through that, which then got it through the General Assembly. So we had a UN Decade for Human Rights Education, which was followed by a second decade. But I have to say that not only did she, I'm very grateful to her for that, but she also organized in about 91, the first, to my knowledge, human rights education conference. She lived in New York City. Were you there, Bill? I can't remember, but I know that. It was held at Columbia University, and she brought in Canadians and Americans, but also some people from around the world. So I met Christy Redelius Palmer there for the first time. I met Ed O'Brien there for the first time, and Abraham McGinso. It was a great contribution because out of it came, and it was academics and activists, and it wasn't a lot of people, maybe 50, and just a weekend, but a lot of good things came out of that, including some of my beloved collaborators, but also that volume, Human Rights Education for the 21st Century, rose out of that conference, which had a lot of contributions from that. Anyway, so Shula and I had been associated, and the World Conference for Women was going to be held in Beijing, and she had affiliates around the world, women that she was bringing to this conference. And she asked me and Julie Mertis, a young lawyer, to put together some kind of a manual for teaching women about their human rights, which we did. It was something slapped together and pretty flimsy, but we brought it to Beijing. And the way it worked in Beijing was that we had sessions, 2-hour sessions all day long. And women would come in from all over the world, and they were there for all kinds of reasons. They represented every kind of issue, reproductive rights, battered women, you name it, women's economic rights. But we did human rights education workshops all day long with these women. And mainly we learned techniques that would bring them together, storytelling, singing, dancing, all kinds of things. But it was a huge learning, and I'm eternally grateful. When we got back, what came out of it was, for me, the first really serious manual of human rights education for women. I did it with Julie Mertis, and who was then teaching at American University, and Malika Dutt, who was associated at that time, I believe, with the Ford Foundation, because she was able to get us some Ford Foundation funding. And it was a great learning about how you put together legal kind of solid background information about what rights are, makes them so ordinary people can use them. So for every theme, there would be learning activities that people could do with a facilitator, but they could do in their living room or with their women's group, or they were easy to use, short exercises that would bring rights home. And I will say that's now in its second edition, and it's in about 5 languages. But I think it was the first really human rights education manual for women. And one of the principles I learned about that is that if you want people to use it in developing countries, it's got to be free. And by this time, we were just beginning to have the internet. So from that time on, I made it a part of my work that anything that I wrote, it might be for sale the first couple of years, but after that, it had to be free on the internet. So that led me into women's rights. I've always wanted to be a generalist and not a specialist, but the techniques I had learned elsewhere, and part of that elsewhere was with the project that we did for the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, which was called Human Rights USA. And that was a Ford Foundation funded coalition that included the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center, Street Law Project, Amnesty, I was represented, and a group that no longer now exists called the National Center for Human Rights Education, which was headed by Loretta Ross. And that project, again, was all about bringing it home. How do you make human rights part of everybody's life? I then, from that manual, I began to work a lot with women's groups. I did some of the most meaningful groups where there was one called Women's Learning Partnership, which is in Washington, but it works with women in the Muslim world. And they were doing women's human rights education in the Muslim world. So they, for example, did the first manual, to my knowledge, in Arabic for Arabic or Muslim women on violence against women. And they realized that women in many societies could not go out to a meeting. So it was designed to be done in people's living rooms. And they also passed it by a number of imams to make sure, and every lesson had Quranic quotations and quotations from the Hadith, so that it was acceptable. If anybody picked it up at random, they would not find it scandalous. It was very carefully done. And again, great learning for me about the different kinds of issues that they brought together women from around the world to be trained to use their manuals. And
Let
that
me
was,
ask you a follow-up on that, though. I
yeah.
mean, you have talked a lot about how you've adapted materials to other cultural norms
Mhm.
so that you could have an entry point into communication. If you use that idea, how would you now address the recent Supreme Court decision dealing with reproductive rights as a human right in this country? Is that an opportunity?
Oh, that's a big jump. I was going to say that the first principle of adaptation is you have to work with people from that culture. I
Yeah,
couldn't possibly know, and one of my favorite examples is doing a training in Romania, and I'll say more about this later, but I felt it very strongly as a consultant that I shouldn't just parachute in and do my work and leave. And I learned that I could negotiate what I thought was important, and what was most important to me was building a local team. And
yeah,
so the example I was going to give in Romania is I to train people to work as a team with me, and so they could, number one, use their native language, but number two, know what the issues were and what the cultural norms were. So I remember early on in Romania, we were trying to make an agenda, and I said, well, why don't we have discussion groups during lunch? And they said, you can't possibly work during lunch. Lunch, you don't work during a meal, and lunch can't be an hour. I'd say it has to be 2 hours. And I said, oh, come on, you can't give up that. How would I know? How would
right.
I know what was
Sure.
possible? So that learning to not only build a team and come back more than once, but also to leave a team on the ground so that the people that you were training who came to the workshops had that team as resources. They could consult, they could come
Right.
back together. And I really tried to build that into the budget for any project, that bringing participants back together. Now, the question you asked was about the United States. Yeah, I think that it would be, the trouble is you can't do trainings about human rights and reproductive rights using CEDAW, the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, since it's not a legal document, not a ratified document in the United States. You can
Right.
refer to it. So you pretty much need to stick to the Universal Declaration. But there again, we know that very few Americans have even heard of it.
Right.
The privacy clause, the right to health, you can approach it from those ways. And again, you have to ask people, who are their constituents? Whom are they reaching out to?
Right.
Is it a church group? Is it a women's club? Is it the League of Women? Is it an alumni group from a women's
Right.
college? Many people
Right.
who are interested in this, but you have to start with, we're not just talking about the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about
Yeah.
an international norm and standard. It's putting that, as you were saying, that globalized view on things.
Yeah.
That's hard but necessary. But it also gives people the sense that they're united. I found that with women's human rights in general, with international groups, that there's a kind of solidarity that among women, that, oh, we all have these rights. We may be working on inheritance rights in Africa, or we may be working on reproductive rights in the United States, but we're drawing from the same authority. And that authority is simply consensus, international consensus, the best wisdom we have so far.
You've just recently developed and written an essay with Abraham Agenzo Kay for a forthcoming book. And the interesting thing to me is you did a wonderful job surveying the history of human rights education and sort of establishing its current status. But going forward, based on that work, what are some insights you think would guide human rights education forward, not only in the US, but what are some sort of big ideas that you think have to be embraced to move it ahead?
I'm smiling because I want to go back a little bit. Abraham and I we are two octogenarians, and we were kind of there in the beginning. So we thought we knew a thing or two. And you and Gloria Alter gently said to us when we gave our first draft in, you need more recent scholarship. And that was such a great nudge because I had not kept up with recent scholarship. And there is. At the beginning, there was no scholarship. There were no degrees in human rights education. Now we have 2 academic journals of human rights education. The nudge to really look at how the field has grown and been recognized was wonderful. But your question is bigger. And I think I'm particularly focused on the United States. I think, well, 3 things I think would. One is that most people don't know. So teachers don't feel comfortable, even in Europe, where the Council of Europe has made it a common thing around Europe. When national surveys are done, what teachers say is the thing that they lack most is their own familiarity. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel authorized. They didn't learn it early enough. So one focus for me would be putting it into everybody's basic education. But how do you do that? And I think the word is not wrong. You have to infiltrate schools of education. One of my goals would be to see many professions, starting with education, require. I mean, we now know that to get a master's in social work, now one of the standards is a course in human rights. Every teacher presumably cares about kids. Every teacher should know about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Why not? But it's many other professions, journalists, physicians, police. There's so many professions. All of us need it to start with, but professional people need that grounding too. You could name almost any profession at all. Lawyers. I mean, you can become an international lawyer and not know too much about human rights. It's something that's really missing basically from our education. And Bill, I think, correct me if you know otherwise, but I think when you and I started out, all of us were self-taught. If the people who knew about it were mostly lawyers, and it was something in law schools. I don't know, how did you learn about human rights?
I was interested in the study of the Holocaust and genocides, and then I read that special edition in social education, and then I got involved with Amnesty, and so it became a process, right? You teach yourself and you learn from others, but I had absolutely no formal education, none, zero.
Nor did I. I can remember I'd never heard of the Universal Declaration. I got the name wrong all the time.
Right.
I never looked at it. So I think there's a new generation who have more knowledge, but it seems to me it's something so basic. So that's one goal. Now, how do you achieve that in the United States? I've often said, if we had one Ministry of Education, it might be a top-down diktat, but we don't. We have 50 states and 50 boards of education in every county, and every district is so different. So I think that a top-down method will not really work very well here. And what will work, I do think that one of the things that helps people learn is when they really want to know, when they need to know. And I think maybe the kinds of violations of the rule of law and of democracy that we're seeing, maybe that will instill some wish to have something to base your protest on. The other thing is globalization, that as the world grows smaller, if we begin, as we seem to be, isolating ourselves more and more, I think people will begin to see that we're losing out. We really will be losing out by isolating
I think
ourselves.
you're right there. I think, the most recent administration, not the current one, but the prior one with President Trump, was an effort to try to narrow the frame of reference.
Absolutely.
Extremely nationalistic. It was xenophobic. And I think in other ways, a prelude to an authoritarian state. So I think what you're seeing now is that when people see that, they say, oh, well, we better have a free press. We better have academic freedom. On the other hand, it's a struggle. So I think part of the job of human rights education, and see what you think of this, is to actually form alliances with other groups to engage those issues. For example, PEN America might be a great alliance because they defend freedom of expression. And I think, library associations, but I think in some ways we need to be a little more aggressive, I would argue, in trying to forge those alliances.
Yeah, I would also mention the teachers union. We've had good support
Yes,
from the uh, in in NEA. We
right.
have less contact these days with the AFT, but yes, they have. That's one of the largest unions in the country,
Yeah.
and they have been supportive, but carefully so. Um, I agree, and we also, and I'll go back again. That was one of the things I think that was uncomfortable for Amnesty International in the beginning, was that we had permission to form alliances, whereas it was an amnesty policy, except for the death penalty, not to work with other groups,
Yeah.
lest you get identified with other groups. And finding those allies was important at the beginning, and I think it's still extremely important.
Well, it's a
Um,
political engagement. You're engaged in politics when you're doing this. You can't avoid it.
no, and that makes some people very uncomfortable, especially groups, let's say, groups that think of themselves as apolitical. Church groups have been very supportive of
Yes.
human rights in principle, but they kind of back off. And the same thing with school related schools, as you've already said, are by nature and should be conservative, slow to change, and therefore anything that looks a little too radical. So one has to move carefully, but you can't also move too slowly these days. I think you have to be really alert. We learned a lot from the Latin Americans through popular education.
Hmm.
We learned a lot from the Philippines and other places where popular education, and maybe that's where we're headed. It's not something that's really familiar to a lot of Americans. And I think
Well,
there's a
I
lot of
think there's
suspicion.
another, there's another tradition too, and that is, in the United States, it was union education, or it was the freedom schools in the 1960s, and
Right.
other forms of non-formal education, let's say, for lack of a better term, where there are
Mhm.
opportunities. And I think electronically, there are a lot of opportunities now that didn't exist 30 years ago.
Are we using those opportunities?
Well, that's an interesting issue, and I think we probably can do more and be more creative with it.
Yeah. And when I say that, I agree with you. And I think it's another, again, speaking with as the voice of history, it's the young people who know how to do that. I have, I think I'm really smart to be doing a Zoom interview. It's
Yeah.
about the limit of my
Right.
electronic capabilities. But to go back to the idea too of a global perspective, I think that's something. Uh, so many Americans are monolingual.
Yep.
uh, Many Americans have really perhaps never met a person from another country unless it was a manual laborer. They have, especially I think, again, I live on a coast and I've always lived in by coastal, but I think that, but my roots are in the South. And I know that, for example, my now would be 112-year-old mother-in-law only met foreigners who were workers, who were
Hmm.
migrant workers,
Right.
agricultural workers. And the idea of what you said earlier about the idea that this really is a multicultural, multiracial democracy, that's part of human rights education too. And
Well,
how
what's interesting is that you mentioned this idea of limited contact. I think there's some evidence to show that people are more siloed today than they've been in the past because they tend to go to the media that they find reassuring and things of that sort. On the other hand, though, what I have been heartened by has been the willingness to challenge the mainstream narratives in history, for example. The challenging of the
Mhm.
Confederate monuments, the
Right.
idea that we should be re-examining Native American history, and all this, because those are fertile grounds for human rights education.
They are. They're also treacherous because each of those issues that you just named involves challenging a myth about who we are,
That's
a
correct.
myth about what is this country. I think all nations build their own
Yes,
mythology,
they
and when
do.
you question one, you're questioning for a lot of people identity issues that are very, very sensitive and painful. I want to go back. I mentioned human rights education, popular education, but if there was one group besides educators themselves that I would want to reach out to, I just had a recent conversation with someone from the UN High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights. They have some funding to do a human rights project in the United States. They usually do it in developing countries. They've never done one in the United States. And they were saying, what could we do that would be useful? And we were playing with this idea: who are influential people who really need to know about human rights? And we began to think about congressional aides. I'm Senator X from state Y, and here's the bill that has a human rights component. And I turn to my aide and say, read this and let me know where I should stand on this. The aides themselves are a group that I think would make a marvelous, I don't want to use the word, but I will, target for human rights education. Most of them are young and smart and energetic and have very little background in human rights. In fact, one of the things that you asked earlier about what Abraham and I came away with, one of them was actually inspiring and delightful to see how many ways there are to do human rights education, how many places there are to do it in a meaningful way, how many ways there are innovative and just really creative new ideas. There's a lot of energy behind it right now that I've never had before. One other thing that I would say is language is important. There's something about the phrase. A journalist once told me that if you call something human rights, you won't get it on the front page. If your headline is human rights, you'll get it on page 3 or 4. If you call it something else, like social justice, you might get it on the front page. So there's something about the way human rights and human rights education itself are presented that we probably need to not change the words, but to somehow recalibrate so that it seems less foreign. It's not about leftist ideas. It's not about people's problems somewhere else. But it relates to these social justice issues. People can feel comfortable with terms like that.
Oh, I think Bernie Sanders, I think he proved that. In every campaign speech, when he called healthcare a human right, he changed the conversation in this country. And now we know from 10 years of evidence that the Affordable Care Act is not only popular, but it's viewed as essential by many millions of people in this country. But I think that's the type of framing that would help. Now, before we move to the closure here, I wanted to ask you 3 questions. And these 3 questions I think are interesting because they'll be something that we can talk about with other people on the series, but I'd like your answers to these. Who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education? That can be someone who's alive today or has passed on.
I'm reluctant ever I'm reluctant ever to name a hero because there's so many, and if you name one, you exclude another. There's a wonderful activity called calling out the names, where people call out the names, say it out loud of their inspirations. There've been too many, and I think, Bill, and I think you'd agree with me that one of the privileges of this work has been the extraordinary people you work with, their agree. Dedication, they're living by the principles that human rights tends to hold up. So I actually refuse to name a hero. I've seen some examples of mistakes that we've made. I think there's, particularly in the women's human rights world, I used to call it founding mother syndrome, where somebody starts something wonderful but can't let go of it. But that's true in many walks of life, not human rights education. So I decline to name a hero, except I'll say I have been blessed with wonderful colleagues, yourself included. But they are the principles that human rights we work for are so embodied in these people and in their dedication and the way they live their lives.
Okay, so the second question is, what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Oh, I think that's easy for me. Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In
Now,
other words,
interesting that you mentioned King, because he was one of the people who actually embraced the idea of human rights,
yes.
went beyond the concept of civil rights, right? Particularly when he opposed the Vietnam War and the Poor People's Campaign and all this.
Right.
And I
He
think
died
that
in
was
Memphis for
exactly,
economic rights, and he was there for that. But Malcolm X did too.
yes,
After his visit to Mecca, he came back and said, "This is not about civil rights; it's about human rights and
right,
human dignity." So yes, and I think both of them did not live to follow through on that, but very much so.
right. And the last question is, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance HRE in this country, what would you do?
I would make it a licensing requirement, a course in at least one course in human rights, a licensing requirement for all educators at any level. Of course, you can't really do that for colleges, but professional training, connecting whatever your work is, you're a healthcare worker, you're a lawyer, to human rights, just as a fundamental part of your work. But I think I would start with schools of education and making it a requirement that every teacher should have a course in human rights, especially on the rights of the child.
Well, that's interesting because, in the book you mentioned that Gloria and I have been working on, Catherine Covell and Brian Howe from Canada have a nice chapter in there dealing with the actual implementation of that in Canada and in Great Britain. And I think there's a lot of evidence to show that that would be a very powerful idea, not necessarily the licensing piece, but the teaching about it and about children, the emphasis on children. Very
Yes.
important.
Another thing about it, though, is that, for example, in the Philippines, after the overthrow of the Marcos regime, human rights education was required in all schools.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about it is it has to have a long period of time to establish itself.
Right.
We've very seldom had time to institutionalize human rights education sufficiently. I won't say that the retreat back to another Marcos regime in the Philippines is a failure of human rights education, but that licensing is something that you do, and then you have a whole generation of people. It takes time. I've often said that human rights education is a very slow growing vegetable.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't blossom in a season.
Yeah,
So,
I would agree with that. And I think part of the challenge that human rights educators face is being patient.
yes.
They have to be persistent and they have to be patient if they want to see change that will become long lasting and institutionalized. Part of the challenge I think that any change meets is that people are going to feel that is a potential threat to their comfort, or that it's going to require them to rethink established patterns of behavior or thinking. And I think that's part of what we have to do, because I've always felt that education required changes in behavior. It's not just requires one to have an attitude change. You have to change your behavior. And so one of the things that actually achieved that was desegregation. And it's sad that in the United States today, we're more segregated than we were in the last 30 years. But I think the effort to desegregate really forced behavior changes.
That's a very good point. And to the longevity issue, I'd also say that a lot has to do with funding. Mm-hmm. And to find adequate funding for the long range.
Yes.
One of the issues in our field is we don't have long-term studies of the effectiveness of human rights education,
right,
because we haven't had that kind of committed investment.
Yeah.
I hope we will someday, but that's part of our we're planting annuals instead of perennials, to use a gardening phrase. I would like, and that's why I think if my one thing would be the licensing of teachers, because that is a perennial that affects the people that they teach, but also a whole generation of teachers.
And it would also then stimulate the training of teacher educators,
Yes.
because that's another
Well,
real deficit we have right now, that it's, even if you mandated it, who would do it?
well, I think the schools of social work have had to scramble once they put
Yes,
that requirement in. Well, who's going to do it? I guess we better find somebody. And I think they have. They've drawn from other departments.
right.
But it's been, I think the way it was done has been a good model for how it might be done for other professions.
Well,
Um,
the other thing about it is that there are hundreds of examples, I'm sure, of initiatives that people wanted to put in place, but then there'd be 1,000 questions as to why they couldn't succeed. So if you go back to when Truman desegregated the military, all the opponents of that raised 100 questions or 1,000 questions. It would never work and this wouldn't happen, right? But it happened and it succeeded. But I think you have to have determination and you have to have commitment in order to make it succeed. And so I think that's always going to be a challenge when you make an institutionalized change like that.
I also think that among us human rights educators, if we have one shared quality, it's optimism.
That's
We
correct.
would still be hacking away at this mountain if we didn't have that. So,
Well, when I did my doctoral dissertation, I interviewed Elizabeth Valens, who was a curriculum theorist at the University of Kansas. And I asked her, what do you think is a critical quality of being an educator who makes change? She says, you have to be an optimist. You have to have an idealistic perception of or a conception. Because if you don't think things are going to get better by what you're doing, then you have to question why you're doing it at all.
that's right.
I've always gone back to that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's another reason that I feel so strongly about the existence of Human Rights Educators USA, because often those idealistic, optimistic educators are working alone.
Correct.
They're the voice in the wilderness, and they need to know that there are other voices,
Yep.
there's support for them. So many times people have said, I thought I was the only one trying to do this. Oh, there are
Well,
others.
that's a nice segue to our conclusion here, because I will say now that minus your input, there would not have been any Human Rights Educators USA when we started that at Harvard 10 years ago. And I think your example is one that really is stellar for anyone in the field to look at, because you've not only been a great advocate, but you've been a great reflective thinker about it, Nancy. And I think your publications and your continued involvement in it shows that you're committed to it.
Well, certainly, thank you. Commitment is there. About Human Rights Educators USA, I just have to say that it was Felisa Tibbets and I met Felisa in Albania years and years ago. We were both working internationally, and our conversations kept coming back to the fact that we were from the United States and we wanted to work in our country. And it was just the very fact that the work that was as consultants we were called to do was always in somebody else's country.
Mm-hmm.
And we felt so strongly that it was time to work in this country. So thank you, Bill. It's really been fun to not only to talk to you, but to reflect on these things. Your questions are hard. You must have been I know you were a great teacher asking the difficult questions, but they're good to think about. I'm going to think some more too.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program features a conversation with David Shyman, Professor Emeritus at the University of Vermont and a longtime leader in human rights education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernekes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, and production coordinators Jasmine Chizugota and Natella Jordan. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action located in Ithaca, New York.